Hi, Whiskey Ringers. I hope you're all well and enjoying the podcast. As always, I welcome any thoughts, suggestions, and feedback you have to make the podcast better, and of course, any suggestions you have for guests you'd like to see. I wanted to share with you a new way to participate in the Whiskey Ring Podcast Bottle Share Club. There are several people who have reached out to me about being put on a waiting list for the top tier. After much thought, I've decided to open that tier up to more people. If you have been hesitating, or if you are a current supporter wanting to level up, reach out to me at david@whiskeyinmyweddingring.com or through social media or Patreon, and I'll be happy to help you move up. I also wanted to send a special thanks to my current $25 a month patrons, who have agreed not only to this change, but who have been truly irreplaceable supporters of this and who make this podcast happen. Thank you to all of you in no particular order. I'm talking to you, Ken, Jesse, Jim, Bill, Don, and John, Yana, Connor, Zach, Scott, Ollie, Steve, and Jake. Without your support, this podcast wouldn't be happening anymore. And thank you for helping me to keep the lights on and keep guests coming to you every week. As always, you could support the podcast for as little as $1 a month, with ad-free episodes starting at $5 a month. This support is the reason the lights stay on, and to make sure the podcast and website are the best they can be. Thank you to all who are already patrons, and I hope to have more listeners join soon. Visit patreon.com/whiskeyinmyweddingring to join today. Without further ado, here's a new episode of the Whiskey Ring Podcast. Hey folks, welcome to a new episode of the Whiskey Ring Podcast. Today I am thrilled to be going to Western Kentucky, somewhere we haven't really been in a while, but oddly enough, we'll be visiting again shortly. And today we're going to be visiting with Casey Jones Distillery. And to talk about Casey Jones, I've got on Cody Turner. He is the COO and partner at the distillery. So Cody, welcome on.
Thank you so much for having me on the podcast. We just, spoke a little bit before we started recording, and just to reiterate, a lot of folks don't know the amount of work and effort and energy that goes into building a podcast and being in that space in this industry. And so, I hope your listeners know that you put in the effort every day, and we on the supplier side, we appreciate you all. It means the world to us to be able to be a part of a podcast in the space and just to have an opportunity to interface with people. So thank you.
Absolutely, much appreciated. And I should also say that if listeners, you've heard me reference a couple of these podcasts before, but especially you should listen to Cody, who was on Embellish Pod with our friend John Hughes back in February. So definitely, if I've missed anything, go back listen to John's episode. Pulled a few questions from there that I'm going to build on, but it's just a great episode on in and of itself to learn more about Casey Jones. So with that, let's start off with the basic question: who was Casey Jones?
Yeah, so we pretty proud of our heritage, and I'd say that we honestly probably have the second most compelling story in the industry, which is pretty cool among craft. I'm going to give the nod to Uncle Nearest for the most compelling story. I mean, that is just absolutely fantastic and fascinating. And if you don't know their story, I highly recommend that you look it up. Um, our story begins with obviously the story's namesake, Casey Jones. So Casey Jones was a real person. He was actually the grandfather of the current, the master distiller, AJ. And AJ's grandfather, Casey Jones, he was this still builder during Prohibition. He was illiterate. He couldn't read, couldn't write, but just an engineering savant. And he was originally a coffin builder by trade. And as a younger man, he was actually challenged to build a still. And so his design background being in the coffin space, he decided to create a square pot or coffin pot still. And as you might imagine, and you can see a picture of this on our website, it is literally a rectangular still. So that still was designed for several reasons with the square shape in mind. One of which was that it would fit actually in the back of a Model A pickup truck by design. And you could imagine if you wanted to have a mobile still, it would be nice for it to be able to fit in the back of a pickup truck. So the still actually also came apart into three separate pieces. So you have the actual still body itself. And then you had the line arm up at the top and the condenser to the right. And those were three independent pieces. And so it was really designed to be very mobile and to produce some fantastic juice in a very short amount of time. Now, if we wanted to go make shine, these components, they all had handles on them. So you and I could grab a handle of the still body itself. I could strap the condenser on my back. You could strap the line arm on your back, and we could go out into the woods and we can make shine. And he made hundreds of these things during Prohibition in what is the land between the lakes. Then it was the land between the rivers area, about 45 minutes west of the distillery. Well, they were incredible. They made fantastic product. They made product very quickly. And we don't get into this a whole lot except at the distillery on occasion, but he actually also innovated a really, uh, um, for its day, fancy condenser that didn't really exist in the States at the time. And that was this double walled condenser, very similar to the condensers that we use in modern stills today. And you can imagine a Yeti cup. Everybody kind of knows what that looks like. At the time, most stills were using literally a 53-gallon wooden barrel. They were running cold water into that wooden barrel, and then a worm or snake of copper tube would run down into that barrel. And obviously, as the still evaporated all of the water and alcohol up through the line arm, that evaporation would push that condensate down that spiral into interfacing with the cold water around the copper, and that would condense that condensate back into alcohol and water. So those designs were pretty inefficient in terms of the amount of water you had to constantly feed those things in order to cool that vapor down and to turn that into liquid alcohol. Well, he comes along and he creates a literally double walled condenser, just like you would see in a modern still. And so the alcohol vapor is going on the outside of this wall, and the cooling water is on the inside. It's much, much more efficient. And I can tell you, to skip ahead a little bit, AJ actually recreated his grandfather's still, which is what we used for the first 8 years of operation. And when that thing runs, it's like turning on a tap. I mean, it literally just runs through alcohol. It's really fascinating to see. I might actually have a video of that on YouTube if anybody wanted to look. But Casey made these stills, made hundreds of them. And as you might imagine, his blessing was kind of also his curse, because if you were a revenuer and you ran across a square still, it didn't take a whole lot of sleuthing to figure out who actually made it. So to that end, he did get busted for still building twice and was sent to Mill Point Penitentiary, which, again, your listeners should check this out. The history about Mill Point's really fascinating. It used to be called Moonshine U. But upon his second exit from the Mill Point, he decides to hang up his hat. It's like, I'm done, as you might imagine. I think that he was threatened for, I believe, a lifetime sentence after the second time he got busted. So, as you might imagine, the opportunity cost there, it's like, we're not doing that anymore. So
We
he
strike
hangs up
you
his
out kind of
hat.
thing.
Yeah, right. It's funny. Hangs up his hat, and it's just wild turn of events that just seems unreal. The federal government ends up working with TVA, that's the Tennessee Valley Authority, in the land between the rivers area, 45 minutes west of the distillery, dams it up to make hydropower, right? And then it becomes the land between the lakes. Well, the forestry department puts in a visitor center at the land between the lakes. And moonshining was such a big part of the culture in the rivers area prior, they decided to ask Casey if he would build a still for the visitor center. So if you're connecting the dots, that is the federal government asking somebody that they had imprisoned twice to build a still for a visitor center. Cannot imagine being a fly on the wall in that conversation. But he did eventually capitulate and decided to do a still for the visitor center. And he built his only legally made still, and there it sat in the visitor center for years and years and years. Well, they go through a remodel, and the still disappears. Peg and AJ, the founders, this is about, I want to say, 11 years ago, panic, right? Here's his one connection to his grandfather's heritage of moonshining, and it's gone. So they start calling around the visitor center, the forestry department, and work their way up to the top of the command. So the chief officer of the forestry department, and through paperwork and conversation, prove that AJ is actually Casey's grandson. And so they decide to give the still to AJ. And from what I'm told, the traditional 45-minute drive from the distillery to the visitor center turned into a 15-minute drive. And I tailed it over there. Sure enough, they go into a storage center and there's his grandfather's still. So he takes that still back to his then garage on their property at Whitty Lane in Hopkinsville. What do you do when you get your grandfather's only legally made still?
Try to distill on it.
You start running it, right? So he gets
Yeah.
the thing back operational and he starts making shine. Well, I've been told that Peg, his better half, says to him one day, "You got two choices, Buster. You're either hanging up your hat on this or we're going to get a DSP and we're going to do this right." And so, given the ultimatum, decides to do it right. He uses his grandfather's still, which actually hangs above our bar in the distillery today. Beautiful piece of art, and makes his own handmade 140-gallon square pot copper still as using his grandfather's as design inspiration. And that actually is the still that we used for the first 8 years of operation. We retired it literally March of 23.
Yeah, I mean, Casey was, and as I should note, that wasn't his real name. It was Alfred. Right?
Yeah, it was actually
Yeah,
Alfred. Yeah, yeah,
yeah. But he only sold by the case, so
that's
Casey was
correct.
born. You mentioned that he was literate; he couldn't read or write, and
Right.
but his day job, if you will, was as a farmer, and it kind of struck me as interesting, just to highlight once again, as we have in the podcast before, like farmers are some of the people with the most ingenuity
Yeah,
that you'll
yeah,
ever find. That they'll figure out how to solve a problem.
yeah,
They're not calling in someone else to do it. Most of the time, they'll just do it themselves.
yeah.
And in Casey's case, there was no being held back by being illiterate. It was he just did it anyway.
Right.
Um, the other thing that I was thinking too was that in terms of where the land between the lakes is, where the distillery is in the far west of Kentucky. Um, have you ever seen the diagram of the kind of Tornado Alley or Middle United States where uh, they make it so that it's actually a chef holding like a piece of
Yeah,
chicken
yeah.
on a
I
platter?
know exactly what you're talking about. Yeah,
Yeah, it's hilarious and it's totally true. But so you're really in kind of the end of the drumstick,
yeah.
the small end of the drumstick for Kentucky. And what fascinated me was that if you look at Kentucky versus Tennessee, in Tennessee, the moonshine tradition was much stronger in the east. It was
Right.
more mountainous, farther away from the population centers. And in Kentucky, it seems to be the opposite, where north and central Kentucky, you've got all the
Mhm.
major, especially in the north, you've got all the major distilling regions, particularly legal distilling. And then it's in the west where you find more of this illicit distilling and moonshining.
Mhm.
Um, from an historical perspective, is it just a matter of there was less uh, transportation over there? There were fewer revenuers searching around, and kind of what you saw in the East in Tennessee to just
Yeah.
fit like it does with Western Kentucky.
Well, if you rewind the clock, and this is a great conversation, and I'm speculating on quite a bit of this, but just my intuition would tell me if you rewind the clock, actually prior to the interstates, Hopkinsville was on a major U.S. highway, which would be Highway 41, which that corridor runs all the way up to Chicago, and all the way down south to. I'd have to look at this, but it runs through Georgia. I mean, 41 goes north and south for quite a span. You have to think prior to the interstate systems, it was the major transportation, at least on that corridor.
Mm-hmm.
And so rewind the clocks back a bit further, and you think about before the land between the lakes became the lakes and it was the rivers, essentially the geography was really no different than Eastern Tennessee with the mountains. It's just the inverse, it's a bunch of valleys. And so I suspect that there's probably quite a bit more similarity than differences geographically and with respect to what you're saying about access for transportation for the revenuers. I think that actually checks out.
I guess the other thing to think about too, you said Casey built hundreds of these
Mm-hmm.
stills. I imagine we don't even know the true number,
Mm-mm.
only that it's in the hundreds. And
Yeah,
this is
and the
over.
the rumor is that many of them are actually underwater in the lakes where
Hmm,
the TVA flooded that land. Actually, yeah,
that would make sense,
yeah.
honestly. That would, yeah. But if you think about, so his quote unquote day job as a farmer, which is pretty labor intensive and time intensive, and he still has time to build hundreds of stills over about 2 decades worth of work, plus a bit of his own moonshining
Mhm.
and distillation. You kind of have to wonder when the guy ever slept.
Well, a lot more time on your hands. There's no TV and social media, I guess, right?
Very true. Very true.
You don't have to worry about TikTok going into a what do they call that? Doom scrolling. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I won't even, besides the whole like thing about TikTok with China and all that before that, I just don't go on it because it's it's just another one and I don't have enough time. So I feel you on that. But anyway, I digress. Uh, so when what we know today is Casey Jones Distillery, Casey Jones Distilling is founded. So going forward, unless I specifically say otherwise, if I say Casey Jones, I'm talking about the distillery and not the person.
Mhm.
So Casey Jones opens the first product is a moonshine,
Mhm.
which makes sense. It's paying homage to the heritage very directly. And but the first question I have was that when AJ was on the hard proof in July 2020, he was saying that moonshine was the first product, but he's told you're in Kentucky, you may be in the far west, but you're in Kentucky, you got to have a bourbon too. And I'm curious if like, was it someone in particular who told him this, or was it just more the sense of you you're in Kentucky, you have to make a bourbon?
Yeah, I mean, so I'm actually familiar of a story with involving AJ and Fred Minnick and this discussion about bourbon
Mm,
and this moment in time where we had not gone down that path yet. And Fred sort of in a kind of fun loving way chiding AJ about why don't you have any bourbon yet, buddy? And I'm paraphrasing. I don't remember what exact words were, and I wasn't there for it, but I think AJ sort of kind of retorted back something about well, this is the heritage or something. I don't know. I wasn't there, but it's really interesting that you brought that up because it does seem apropos if you are a distillery in Kentucky. It's bourbon, baby. You got to make it. Got to do it. There's obviously economic reason behind that, but it is Kentucky's native export, and it's it would seem weird to not be making it. To be completely frank, it really would. Yeah. And AJ's honed his skills with the Shine first, and then making barrel cut products, which is aged versions of the Moonshine. And then dipped his toes into the bourbon game with our mash bill one, that 96 corn, 3 rye, one malted barley, and started down that path over time. Now, the other piece of this, of course, talking about starting with Moonshine to pay heritage or homage to Casey, his grandfather, there's obviously also huge economic reasons to do that. I mean, the cost of building barrels and sitting on that capital over multiple years before you get a yield off of them is extremely, extremely high. And without outside investments, it's pretty much untenable. You have to have something to generate cash flow before you can start doing something like that.
sure. And at that point, when the distillery was founded in 2014, you would have had a couple of years of seeing other outfits. I'm thinking specifically of Old Smoky in
Mm-hmm.
Tennessee, being completely based around moonshine and flavored moonshines,
Mm-hmm.
and having a very successful product. I think today, if a distillery were to open up, they would have to diversify pretty
Oh
quickly
yeah,
in
absolutely.
that.
Yeah.
But there were certainly examples and continue to be examples of distilleries that survive purely on making different variations of moonshine. Um, yeah, I would love to be a fly on the wall in that conversation too, with
Yeah.
Fred to say, with I guess with the rise of quote unquote legal moonshining, which
Yeah.
is paradoxical term, but legal
Right.
moonshining, like we see from Old Smoky, was were AJ and Peg tempted to say, you know what? I know it's Kentucky, but moonshine is just as much of a heritage as bourbon. we're just going to stick with it. So
I think
I'd be
I think
curious.
he yeah, I think AJ was tepid about doing bourbon at first. I really do. I think that his heritage was, obviously his grandfather and his grandfather's product, that recipe. And then he again, and I'm sure we'll touch on this, but started aging the moonshine in a single barrel aging process, exactly like you would bourbon, but then started double barreling that as well to make a product we call double barrel cut, and it's just absolutely fantastic. It is definitely not a bourbon; it has different notes, but it plays in that corn whiskey and rum space at the same time. So I think he was initially tepid about it, but like I said, it would seem silly to not have bourbon as a Kentucky distillery, where this is such a huge part of the state's heritage and history, and obviously there's economic reasons to do it as well. So
And before I forget, the double barrel cut. I'm fascinated by it
yeah,
because it's a category that is still, infinitesimally small. There are
yeah.
just a handful of people doing blends, if you will, of bourbon and shine together, or whiskey and shine together, I should say. So it's coming together as 50-50 in your case. I'm thinking of, there is another distillery in Iowa that is doing that, and it's harkening back to a prohibition era recipe.
Mm.
Supposedly, I have to talk to them to verify these kinds of things, but I'll take their word for it for now, for the sake of this conversation. I would be interested to see if down the road things like that became their own new category. And certainly, as we're seeing with American single malt, it can take
Mm.
years and years for a
Mm.
category to come out. But right now, it's all kind of lumped into distilled spirit specialties, into DSS.
Exactly. Yeah.
But if you can prove that there's this very well known, assumedly widespread technique of blending these two spirit categories together into something, that perhaps it could become another very American native spirit, if you will.
Yeah, it's an interesting thought to consider what the future might look there. And you're spot on about American single malt. I mean, it's just what an uphill battle to get that defined and recognized. But who knows what the future holds? I mean, I think the thing that's really interesting about distilled specialty spirits as a category is it's just this wide lump all for just so many things. And from the TTB standpoint, I don't know, I mean, think many people know this, but like your bourbons that are finished in rum casks and rye finished in blah 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 casks and blah 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 finished in wine casks. I mean, those are technically not bourbons or ryes anymore. I mean, the technical definition is you get it out of that barrel. If you do anything else to it, it's not technically that spirit anymore. And you can intuit that if you look at the labeling for products of that type. You'll notice that the what is called statement of composition has to clearly state exactly what the composition of that exact spirit is, like bourbon or rye finished in rum casks. And you'll also notice that they're not allowed to make rye a huge font size and everything else super small, and so because that would be misleading to the customer. But technically those are the same category as our double barrel cut, which is a DSS. So who knows? I mean, maybe the TTP will end up making a category for finished spirits. I mean, it's the sky's the limit. Yeah.
Absolutely. So to get back to the starting of the distillery, when AJ was on, also at that same episode of the Hard Proof, he was saying they were only using family recipes that were passed down
Mm-hmm.
to restart. To me, I mean, that made sense for the moonshine. Obviously, we knew that Casey himself was doing shine at the time. I was curious though if he was also meaning about the not only the bourbon but the multiple mash bills that you guys have for bourbons. So
Yeah.
which ones came
No.
from family, which ones were kind of
Yeah.
developed.
Yeah. That's a great question. The moonshine was the family recipe, and
Okay.
the 50% corn, 50% cane used to make the single barrel cut, double barrel cut for sure family recipe. That's all the basically same distillate.
Mhm.
But when you get into the bourbons, I mean, the 9631, that's AJ's contribution. Like that's a mash bill that he came up with. Yeah.
Gotcha. Uh, I have another question about the mash bills later on, but I will.
Yeah.
Uh, yeah, because what I was thinking too was even if the well, even for the moonshine, I mean the mash bills or combinations of spirits would have also just been dictated by what crops they had available,
Mm-hmm.
what they could get to
Mm-hmm.
them at the time, which is usually why we don't have a lot of old recipes
Mm-hmm.
from farm-based distillers. So moving into the process, and you mentioned in the intro the square still,
Mm-hmm.
and of course, with all due respect to it, we will talk about it. It's definitely the main story when you look at it.
Yeah. Yeah.
But yeah, I did want to start uh, going back to that condenser for a second, because to me that's actually the most fascinating part of the innovation.
I completely agree. I 100% agree. And we don't talk about it very much, but I think it's because it's kind of on the more technical side of it. And it's not as
Absolutely,
visual as, oh, square still. Yeah.
I know
Yeah.
it absolutely is. And your description earlier of flipping it so that you had the original worm tub going
Mm-hmm.
into a barrel, so you've got a lot of water that you need to use in there. So is there any indication as to how Casey kind of thought about it, or developed it, or was just ingenuity?
Unfortunately, no. I mean, again, it's such a shame that there's not any historical record or any kind of information that I'm aware of about how he went down this path of developing this. But when I say he was an engineering savant, there's another story we don't tell very often, but he at one point in time was taking these inline four-cylinder engines from these Ford Model A trucks back in the day, and he was splitting the blocks in half and converting them into two piston engines and throwing those on flatboats to help people run shine up and down the rivers. And apparently, Ford got word of this, that he was tearing up his engines and doing this work with it, was super impressed by it, and actually sent a headhunter down to meet up with Casey and potentially hire him. Casey gets wind of this and thinks that it's a revenue coming for him. And so he lays low. And from what I understand, months later, they actually did end up connecting. And he was offered a job at the Ford plant because of his ingenuity, but he declined it because he couldn't read or write.
That would have been a huge change in the whole storyline.
Yeah, we might not be doing what we're doing today.
Exactly. How Let's see. I don't know when Ford died. So I guess that would have been when probably the 20s.
Yeah.
In the 20s, yeah. It's I don't know. That's fascinating. But yeah, the condenser, when I look at it, it seems more like the modern condenser we do.
Yeah.
It's much more water efficient, energy efficient. Um, whether you use copper, I know some people use copper, some people use stainless steel, but copper seems to make more sense.
Mm.
The I guess I'm thinking about, is there an historical connection that can be made between his invention of this type of condenser and the fact that so many others then uh, caught wind of it and started using it, particularly in the U.S. because they're not necessarily using it across in Europe or the U.K.,
Right.
but
Right.
for U.S. distillers, they are using that type of condenser tube.
Right. I think a properly trained historian could probably sift that out, and it would be fascinating to know the history of that, and if it did end up inspiring other moonshiners to use the same condenser style. But I'm sure, and you've seen many pictures, historical pictures of stills during the 20s and whatnot, and it's always the wood barrels. That just you never see copper used for condensers. Uh,
Yeah, absolutely. And I think too of how much copper he had to go through
yeah.
to make all these stills.
Oh yeah.
That I mean, that would have been a risk in and of itself, because that's an easy way for revenue to find you, is just getting a lot of copper sent to one place.
You're not exactly making Tesla batteries then.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. So I'm going to jump around a little bit during the process of making the spirit, but the one of the first questions I wanted to ask was about uh, AJ had said that you buy the same yeast that his grandfather
Yeah.
did,
Yeah.
and so at first I'd ask, which yeast is it, if you could
Oh,
share.
I cannot pronounce it. It's Sacra. Uh,
Oh, is it the Cerevisiae?
I can see it in my head, but it's like, it's this many letters. I can pull it up while we're chatting, but yeah, for
That's
sure.
fine. So I mean that's a more common, like a brewers or distillers yeast, which makes sense. It works and it's
Yeah.
very efficient. But yeah, I always like to ask that. Um, so at the same time, so you have someone who's in Casey who is making moonshine. He's definitely not legally distilling, and obviously he's not going to get in trouble at this point. Like there's,
Right.
yeah, that's fine. So, um, I this is another angle. And I know I'm putting you on the spot with so many historical things here, but
No,
this is
no,
another
have
angle
it, man.
to
This is fun.
kind of dive into, which is, um, to make shine, you would have needed a bunch of yeast in the area. If he's using a commercial yeast like that, not just letting whatever's floating around in the air kind of attach and ferment, inoculate and ferment, I should say, then I'm curious if the yeast producers and those selling the yeast ever caught on to what their product was being used to make.
Well, it's a good question, but I also wonder because a square pot still you're not going to have an agitator, so you're having to use a sour mash process,
Hmm.
and I would imagine there's a bit of uh, as you would do with sourdough. There's a bit of starter thing going on there where you continue to keep the mother of the yeast alive and active, and
Hmm.
use it to recharge your fermentation process every time. And we are able to toss new yeast in with the sour mash to start our fermentation for the moonshine at the distillery today. But if you had to, and you had to keep your yeast alive, and you had more time, you could.
That's true.
Yeah.
I'll have to dig into that a little bit because I'm because the yeast makers must have known at that point. Like they probably looked at
Oh yeah,
prohibition just like the alcohol producers did
yeah.
because needed yeast for it.
We
Sorry.
also suspect that's why it was the 50% corn, 50% cane recipe. So you're not you're spreading out a little bit of what you're buying from grain and
Mm.
cane and stuff. And so I don't know. Again, this is pure speculation, but if you were consistently getting corn from the same person every time, and somebody connected the dots that you didn't really have that much livestock to feed, they might put one and two together and, hey, Mr. Revenue, guess what?
Makes sense. So with that on onto the granddaddy itself, the grandfather, the still.
Yeah,
So the grandfather itself, that's the one that you said that is modeled after, uh, or rather, sorry, I think I have two stills in there. So
yes,
there's the original one that Casey
yes,
built for the forestry service and in the TVA visitor
correct.
center that was then found and recovered. Then AJ built one
That's correct.
that mimics that, and then the third iteration is the grandfather. Is that
Absolutely
correct?
correct. Yeah,
Okay. So you've got this 200-gallon pot still called the grandfather, modeled right after the original design. It's square, um, and but also with the expansion that you guys went under in 2022, you also have 1,000-gallon hybrid pot still uh,
yes,
alongside it. So uh, with the square pot so not only intertwined but really central to the mythology of who
yeah.
Casey Jones was and what the distillery is. Um, what does the addition of this hybrid pot mean for anything from branding to production profile?
This is a fascinating topic, and I'm glad you brought this up because we're going to nerd out a little bit, and I've got some fun stories to share about this.
Go
So,
for it.
rewind the clock to 2022, and we're starting this process of. I actually came on as a partner at that point, and wanted to address two things with the distillery. And one was like vertical integration, and the other was distribution. And on the vertical integration side, which is producing on site the bourbons that we want to be able to make, it's like you have to go through this process of building a distillery. And man, it's an undertaking. You to consider your facility and your utilities and your the square footage that you have and your ceiling heights, and how much output do you want to have, and that's going to dictate how much labor you need. And it's a project. I mean, it really is. But then there is, and you got into it, this piece, like this marketing piece that's a part of it, the brand that's a part of it, and wanting to stay true to the heritage of what you've spent the last 8 years building. So we went down the path of working with a still producer. We originally looked at Vendome. At the time, I think Vendome was 36 months out to be able to produce a still for you. So that was an easy no. Very expensive to wait 36 months for your equipment to come in.
Hmm.
So we found a company in British Columbia called Specific Mechanical. And again, for your listeners, highly recommend checking them out. They're a very well esteemed manufacturer in Canada. They've been in the brewing space for years and years and years and years. I mean, they make fantastic equipment. So we interfaced with them, and their lead time was something like 12 months. So, and again, this was coming right off the tails of COVID. So it was, still not where everybody wants to be, but reasonable.
Mhm.
So we hem and haw. Do we want to do a column still? Do we want to do a pot? Do we want to do a hybrid pot? How do we want to go about this process of tackling the vertical integration? So we settle on 1,000 gallon hybrid pot. And again, to geek out a little bit, your pot still is the classic big old pot shaped still, classic lean arm, runs over to a condenser. That's a classic pot still. You can have two types of hybrid stills for anybody who's interested in this stuff, where you've got the pot, and then one type of hybrid pot is in the onion leading up to lean arm. You can have condenser plates just like you would on a column still. This is a really common style of hybrid pot. There's pros and cons to it. One of the cons is that you can't really technically bypass the plates. You
Right.
can and you can't. I mean, if you want heavier alcohol components, you really do need a traditional onion and lean arm. You've got to have that piece. So we ended up going with a traditional pot, classic lean arm with the ability to turn off or on, bypass or use a 4-plate column condenser with a defumator, and then to a column to the right of that. So if we wanted to get into single malts, we could. Um, while building this still with specific mechanical, we entertained at one point in time the idea of putting a square shroud around that pot to make it look like a square pot still. And we considered it for a long time. It was I want to say $35,000-$40,000 option, but Specific was keen on doing that for us if we wanted it. But it just never really settled right with us. We didn't feel like it was, we felt like it was inauthentic. So after much trepidation, we ended up approaching Specific and we talked to them about the potential of making this grandfather still. Now we started working with Specific, I want to say Q1 into Q1 of 22, something like that. And this was already properly in Q2 of 22 before we start talking to them about this square pot still. But they got giddy about it. So we start talking about a square still, and here's a talented group of folks who've built thousands of pot stills and column stills and tanks and you name it, and they're all round.
Mhm.
And so they're extremely excited about the prospect of making a square still for the first time. And so we talked to them, and they're really concerned about that project being in pace with 1,000 gallon. And so they weren't really sure about being able to do it. So the project kind of dies. We go another month, and now it's like probably the end of July or early July. And we get another call from Specific, and we're sitting in our little event space having a meeting. And it's a very different conversation. It's the lead engineer, and again, great group of folks, says to us, look, we've talked to the teams, production, engineering, we've talked to the leadership team. Everybody at this company wants to make this. Like, we want to make this still. And if you'll commit, we will have this still made by the time ADI rolls around in September. And it'll be our showcase piece in September. It was an easy yes.
Sure.
So
Yeah.
we committed, we signed, we made it happen, and they made it happen. By September, ADI was in St. Louis at that time. And there it was, right in the middle of the show floor as the keystone piece for the entire production. It's pretty cool. Yeah.
Absolutely. So I guess I have to ask: was there the option of trying to scale the initial still from the 200 gallon to try to go to 1,000 gallon size?
We
Or
didn't
would
really
have
consider it, I think, because at the time we committed to the 1,000 gallon hybrid pot. And, you've got to have the ability to agitate your mash if you're going to do a sweet mash bourbon distillation. And so that you have to have a round style pot if you're going to pot distill bourbon. It has to happen
Mhm.
if it's going to be a sweet mash. If you're sour mash it, then yeah, you could filter it out, but that's a lot of extra labor. So I think we never really considered making a larger one once we had the 1,000 gallon committed and then signed for the 200 gallon. And again, it's 140 from AJ's originally handmade still to the grandfather being 200 is quite a bit bigger. And we use it exclusively for our sour mash moonshine runs now. And then we'll occasionally put up, and I don't think I've shared with this with anybody else, but we are putting up some finish runs with bourbon in it to do some releases in the future. So
Nice. I mean, I'm I'm excited to taste it. I know the expressions that I have in front of me, the Total Eclipse bourbon, the Mash Bill 2 uh, bourbon, so the red label, and then I'm sorry, the Mash Bill 2 is the black label. Where's the red
correct.
label?
Yeah, yeah.
It's the black label.
Black
Yeah,
labels, Mashville too.
right. And then Mash Bill 3 being the red
The weed.
label,
Yeah.
the weeded. So with these three, so these are all at least 2 point. So the Total Eclipse is the youngest at 2.6 years. The
Mhm.
weeded's 4.4. The bourbon is 3 years. So these are all ones that would have come off of the square pot still.
So
Those first
all of those would have been contract distilled from some other facility in the past, right? When
gotcha.
when we
Okay.
just had the 140 gallon square pot still, again, you can't agitate that.
Mhm.
So because you can never mix up the mash in the corners of a square still. You're never going to be able to keep the mash off of the heat. So you'll send
Right.
your mash. Now you could use a sour mash process, arduous to say the least. So we worked with 3 or 4 different distilleries, gave them our mash bills, our recipes, what we wanted to have distilled. They would use their facility to distill it and then send it to us in totes. We put it in barrels on site and age.
Gotcha. So I did have a question, a clarification question on that. Just looking at the bottle, because it said distilled in Kentucky, aged and
Mhm.
bottled by Casey Jones Distillery. So um, just wording wise, that would have suggested exactly what you said.
Exactly correct. Yeah. Now, if you look at the double
Okay.
barrel cut in the moonshine, you'll see it's distilled and at Casey Jones Distillery because that was all done in the square pot. Yeah. Yeah.
Gotcha. With the new 1,000 gallon hybrid pot now working, do you still have those contracted sites, or is that
Mm. We stopped that in March of last year when we came online. Yeah.
gotcha? So I guess the larger question then for me still remains the same, which is if you're moving from contracting to your own in-house production, how do you feel the transition is going so far in terms of consistency of flavor profile, and where do you think it'll go?
Exceptionally well. And I dare say that we'll have a superior product. So one of the things that AJ did, to his huge credit is he had the forethought to keep samples of unaged white dog from some of the suppliers that we were using. And so whenever we got up and running and we are able to produce the mash bills on site, we could taste our white dog versus what we had been barreling in the past from other producers. And the future looks very bright. We'll say that. Yeah.
Well, to play on that and not to darken the future, but we are talking the day before the eclipse.
Yeah.
So when this comes out, it'll be after the eclipse has already happened. But as I said, one of the expressions I have is the total eclipse bourbon. Now, I wanted to just talk about that a little bit before jumping back into the distillation process. So in Hopkinsville, Kentucky, you guys have been very fortunate. You were in the epicenter in the path of totality for the 2017 eclipse, and then this year, I mean, you're not on the line of totality, but you're pretty close. You're like
Yeah.
99.6% or
Yeah.
something like
Something
that.
like that. Yeah. 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 It's pretty
Yeah.
close.
So it's very very close, and so you knew that you'd be there a couple years in advance. I think it was brilliant. I heard AJ saying that he had went out and
Mm-hmm.
trademarked the Total Eclipse name 2 years before the 2017 one, so in 2015, and makes you able to say you're the official bourbon of the Eclipse,
Oh, the total eclipse. Correct. Yeah.
of the Total Eclipse, and of course bottled at 100 proof for the 100%
Of course.
that you had in 2017. And I must say also, we've got friends who are traveling to the path of totality and they travel to every total solar eclipse or nearly every one that you can get to. So I don't think they'll be in Hopkinsville. They'll be a little bit north of you. I think they're in
Mm,
maybe
mm,
southern Illinois,
mm.
but I can see that. But anyway, the point being, in 2017, when you guys had the totality, you threw a party.
Yeah.
You had like
It-
6,000 people there, and
yeah.
so, well, what was that like, and what are you doing this year?
So I actually was not involved with the distillery at all in 2017,
Right,
but I have heard stories of and have
right.
seen video footage of what was an absolute banger of a party. So you just the actual epicenter for the best place in the world to see the eclipse in 17 was literally 3 miles from the distillery. I mean, it was we were right there, and we had thousands of people come into the distillery over the course of the weekend to view the eclipse. People in RVs, people camping in tents, folks just staying for the day or staying over the weekend. I mean, it was. I've seen drone footage of it, and it's like I think they actually worked with the farmer next door and rented out their field for parking. I mean, it was just tons and tons and tons and tons and tons of people. Of course, we didn't have the rick house at the front of the property at that point either. So the entire front field, I mean, tons of people there. Hot air balloon rides. I think somebody got proposed to during. I mean, it was an absolute mash.
Awesome. And so this year, what are you planning for?
Yeah, so we had our big eclipse event actually technically yesterday, and we're going to have a smaller one tomorrow, Monday, the actual day of the eclipse. But we put up about 4 barrels of barrel cut single barrel in 2017 for the eclipse into Kelvin heavy char medium toast barrels, and we've dumped the first one of those about 3 or 4 days ago. And that barrel's properly 7 years old at this point. It's the oldest spirit that we have. And we released a single barrel Eclipse cask, a small, I think it's 150 bottles, is what we had left of that particular product. And some of us got to snatch a bottle, and I definitely took mine. And it's just that mash bill is really really interesting. The corn and cane, the single barrel cut, which is once barrel aged, it mostly harkens to corn whiskey, almost like a Melcorn vibe. But then the double barrel cut, where we've reintroduced it to a used bourbon barrel, all these lovely rum notes start to come out of that. With a single barrel Eclipse cask at 7 years, it's only been in one barrel. It's not been double barreled, and it is starting to get some of the rum notes out of it, anyways, which is fascinating. Just the influence from the wood and the finish on that is this just lovely, distinct toasted marshmallow. So yeah,
Nice, nice. Well, next eclipse won't be until 2044 in the US at
yeah,
least.
yeah.
So, we'll see what happens 20 years down the line. But you've got the trademark. You can use there's still this, the bourbon of the eclipse.
We're
So
not putting up barrels Monday.
yeah, I mean,
Yeah,
might as well, right?
yeah.
So the so jumping back now to the still. Uh, this was from this question comes from your appearance on Embellish Pod. You'd said that you feel that a still or the still seasons like a cast iron skillet.
Mm-hmm.
And I wanted to clarify because I wasn't sure from my notes if you meant the square pot or the hybrid pot
The
on that.
square pot for
The
sure.
square
Yeah.
pot. Okay,
And again,
that's what I
it's
thought, but I
because you
want to make
can't
sure.
agitate it. So, at
Yeah,
some point in time, you're getting some seasoning going on there. It just has to
right,
be.
right. And I was thinking too, if, to take that comparison further in a way, uh, whenever you do a pot still distillation, you've got to also have those things of like cleaning it out between
Mhm.
sessions, between runs. So if you're the distiller and you're looking to retain that seasonings, I think that's a good way to put it. How do you balance, cleaning it as much as you need to sanitize it for the next run while retaining what's kind of building into the copper, into those corners and creeks?
Well, I suspect that cleaning is a molecules are very small, right? And so
Right.
I'd imagine that even if you clean it at some point, you're not, it will season and age over time. It has to. Like, there's just no way to completely get it on a molecular level, free and void of everything that was in it in the past. And
Sure.
there's, I'm way stepping out on a limb here, but you might be able to tag in on this. But there is something to the chemical reaction with the vapor and the copper itself, which is why people use copper stills for the flavor of the actual distillate. That you know that there is some interaction with particles. There has to be, right? If there
Mhm.
wasn't, then it wouldn't matter what you used. You could use stainless steel; it would not change the flavor at all. And so I suspect that what you're seeing in the square pot still, because you can't agitate it, is that, and even the agitation is a part of what you use to clean. You'll have a
Mhm.
spray valve, you'll turn the agitator on, and you'll use it to really mix up in that pot still.
Mhm.
We got a spray valve in the square pot, but there's no agitator. So, clean enough to use again, absolutely, it's not a question. But
Mhm.
I can see it aging, uh, seasoning over time a little bit quicker. I guess that makes sense. Yeah, it's a good way to say it.
And I mean, you have a good point too that it's because you're not sweet mashing it,
Yeah.
it doesn't have to be. Uh, it'll still be clean. Like that's it's. We're not
Right.
saying it's not
Right.
clean, but it doesn't
Yeah.
have to be as sparkling spotless as you would if it's sweet mashing or if you're making a beer, where you have the risk of bacterial contamination. If you're
Right.
using
Right.
sour mash, that's a lot
That's kind of
lower.
the whole point, right? You've got all the sugar
Exactly.
out of it. Yeah. Yeah.
Right. So
Yeah.
yeah, you're controlling the microbiotic environment much closer. Uh, so on the going off of that, uh, so for the square pot, I guess then, as you were saying or alluding to earlier, you would have had to distill mostly as off grain as possible.
Mhm.
I guess in order to not scorch it because you couldn't
Right.
agitate it.
Right.
Um, with the hybrid pot, are you still doing off grain or are you doing some on grain?
Oh, it's a purely sweet mash process. So we're not doing any sour mash in the pot still at all. Um, if you're using that to mean on grain, like with the
Mhm.
grain actually in the distillate,
Yeah,
yeah, yeah, yeah, absolutely, yeah.
yeah.
I apologize, I'm not familiar with the term. Yeah,
No, that's fine. I was thinking because with most American whiskeys, and this is an overgeneralization, but go with me on this. We'll use on grain. They'll have the corn and rye and malted barley all in the still.
yes,
But as we keep saying, like those stills are going to have agitators so that the grain does not scorch on the bottom and
right.
burn and give a burnt taste to the spirit. But in that sense, if you're so the few exceptions are ones where they'll pull it off so you get a clear wort, clear liquid, and then just distill that. You there are certain benefits to that. There are downsides to that, which of course every distiller kind of balances as to whether you want the flavors that might be inherent in the grain that when they're heated up again or avoidance of burning. So it could go
Well,
either way.
and in a purely traditional pot, if you're doing a bourbon run, you're not going to get the proof off of that first run. It's just not going to happen. You're not going to be able to. Your initial bricks is not going to be high enough that when you distill that you've got enough 120 proof gallon hearts to put into a barrel or 125 to put in a barrel. You're not going to have it. So you're going to essentially collect up all of the heads, tails, and hearts and redistill them to proof them up in a traditional pot, double pot distilled. But with our
Right.
hybrid pot, we've got that 4 plate condenser with a deformator on top. And by controlling the plates, we can actually come off of that still on an initial run around 150, 155.
That's pretty good.
Yeah.
So you get off the up to, let's say you go up to 150, 155 on the distillation. What do you end up entering the barrels at?
It varies, right? And so this is just such an interesting place in distillery inside baseball, if forgive the phraseology, but
Mhm.
there's economic concerns about what proof to put up barrels at. And your listeners again your intuition would tell you that the more proof gallons you can get into a barrel, the better, because you're spreading the cost of the barrel, the wood, over the proof gallons.
Mm.
And so you might want to do everything up at 125, or everything at 120 or something like that. But when you start thinking about longer term projects and having a 5-year old, a 10-year old, a 12-year old, a 15-year old, you have to be careful with that because you have to be thinking about what proof you want to put in and where that barrel is going to go into the rick house and what kind of evaporation is it going to experience.
Mm.
If you want uh, play on Garrison Brothers, for example, if you want a 138 proof cowboy bourbon, right, you're going to put that sucker up at 125 into a 35-gallon barrel, and that thing's
Mm.
going to the top of the rick house. And
Right.
sure enough, in 4 years, you're going to have an ultra high proof, super potent single barrel.
Mm.
But if you want something a little bit more mellow and have some age to it, you might do 115, 110 and keep it in the middle of the rick house for years and years and years, or even do 125 and at the lower part of the rick house where it's going to lose um, some alcohol content and mellow out over time. It's all part and parcel what kind of profiles you're trying to make over time.
To follow that and ask about the barrels, initially there was use of 15s and then 25 gallons barrels over time. What are you guys using now?
So we have some experimental barrels that are 25s, and we use those to uh, rapidly test the aging of the maturate, the distillate, and see how it influences the wood influences the distillate over time and quicker than you would a standard 53-gallon barrel. So we have a very small number of 25s. Everything else we use is 53s. Yeah.
Gotcha. Okay. And the let's see so the last thing I wanted to hit on in the process was going back to those mash bills. You said the 96-3-1, so 96% corn, 3% rye, 1% malted barley, is Age's contribution. That's
Yeah.
a brand new mash bill. I'm not familiar with anyone else using it. It's obviously very, very high corn, but it's not it's not the 99-1 recipe that from
Right.
Indiana or anything like that. So it is different. And then the mash bill, so that's mash bill one,
Mm-hmm.
which is under your white label.
Correct.
Mash bill two, as we were saying, the black label is a blend of the 96-3-1 from mash bill one, and
Correct.
then 75-21-4 to make a final
Correct.
mash bill. Listeners, hope you're keeping track right now and haven't turned me off. Is you make a final mash bill of 80% 16-4
Right.
for mash bill two. So I do have to ask where the 75% is coming from. Like, was that also partly contract distilled?
Oh, that's Green River for sure. Yeah.
That's Green River. Okay.
Mhm.
Which makes sense. I
It
mean,
was
that's
originally OZ, then Green River. Sorry. Yeah.
right. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Um, I keep meaning to have Green River on specifically. I've had many people who have used them and sourced them and partnered with them, but not actually
Yeah.
have Green River on. And I need to do that. Because I think the transition from OZ Tyler to Green River has been amazing, not only for the distillate,
Oh, yeah.
but for the
Absolutely.
name of the business. Uh, they got rid of the it shall not be named system that was um, doing the rapid aging. But anyway, so that blend, you're getting the 80-16 for the mash bill two. And then for the weeded, it's still a weeded bourbon. So it's a bourbon
Mm-hmm.
first, but it has a very high wheat content.
Mm-hmm.
So it's 4 grain, two different corns, Bloody Butcher and Yellow at
Mm-hmm.
26.5% each. And then how much wheat in there after that?
35% wheat. Yeah.
Right. And then a small
And
percentage
then
of
12% malted barley.
12%. Right.
Yeah.
So I'm curious from a flavor perspective. We've seen some experiments with actually a lot of experiments, I would say, with Bloody Butcher.
Mm-hmm.
Yellow corn
Mm-hmm.
being the standard
Mm-hmm.
kind of corn they'd use. Um, do you know if AJ was kind of working with doing all yellow, doing all Bloody Butcher? How did he come up with using the Bloody Butcher as part of it?
So Jeff the Creed's probably the most famous user starter distillery getting into Bloody Butcher corn, and I think many of their mash bills actually include that as a grain, and it's a really really interesting ingredient. Yellow Dent, as most of your listeners will know, it's this fascinating, bright, almost candied sweetness that you get off of Yellow Dent. It is a very sweet corn. There's no doubt about it. Bloody Butcher brings some really interesting nuance to the palate that you really can't get any other way. And a way that I like to describe Bloody Butcher is that it is akin to port wine versus sangria. Sangria being your Yellow Dent, port wine being your Bloody Butcher. It brings this lovely earthy sweetness to the distillate that's just unlike anything else. Now, you have to be careful with it because you don't want your bourbon tasting like dirt.
Right.
And so you have to be really mindful of the proportions that you use when you're using that particular grain. And I think we struck a really nice balance with the sweetness from the Yellow Dent, the mold sweetness from the Bloody Butcher, and then obviously 35% soft red winter wheat's a ton of wheat for a wheated bourbon. That's a high wheat content.
Mm-hmm.
And wheat, if you're unaware, if your listeners are unaware, wheat can actually be, it's a tricky grain in my humble, probably worthless opinion. I just think it's a tricky grain to get the distillate right with wheat. That it is very prone to tasting like grass clippings, which I am not a fan of on my palate at all. And it can actually be very hot, very, very hot. And there's a producer that makes 100% wheat whiskey. And if you don't like hot spirits, it just probably won't speak to your palate because I mean, you would think it was rye, it's so hot.
Mm.
So herein comes this malted barley to help package this all up and balance everything out. And so we've actually gone with two types of barley to help round out the profile on this particular mash bill. We're using a Pilsner malt, which is a great neutral malt. Doesn't have any of that grassy note to it at all. And then I want to say it's a caramel 60 or caramel 70. I don't remember off the top of my head. But as you might imply, the name implies that caramel malt has a caramel flavor to it. It's, toasted, and it's got a really great sweetness, semi-sweetness, and balance that it brings to that particular mash bill. So that's kind of the inspiration behind the mash bill 3.
The having the specifically the Pilsner and the caramel 60 or 70 in there. Was anyone in the distillery a big beer fan that they knew to go for those malts?
Well, I mean, when we started distilling on site, that was the first thing. It's like, let's figure this out. So we brought in a ton of samples of different malts from different producers, and when you're sampling, you literally just chew them, and the enzymes in your saliva break them down in exactly the same way that they'd be broken down in the cooking process, and so you can get a really good feel for what they're going to taste like and what they're going to do to the distillate just by chewing them. So that was the selection process.
Awesome. And do you use the for the mash bill 1 where it's 96% corn? Is that all yellow? No.
Yes, it's all yellow. Yeah.
Okay.
All the
So
other mash bills is all yellow then. Yeah.
Gotcha. So I mean, that would be an interesting comparison then of just trying mash bill 3 against mash bill 1. There's a lot of differences, obviously, being,
Oh yeah.
of course, this one has the wheat in it. But so maybe actually a better comparison would be 2 and 3 as opposed to 1 and 3. But anyway, before I forget it, there are 4 mash bills.
Mm-hmm.
So what is mash bill 4?
Mash bill 4 is the Total Eclipse bourbon, and that's actually a blend of 2 casks to make it. So there's a 75-21-4 that we're blending with a 75-25. The latter being a wheat bourbon and the former being a rye bourbon. So that's how we're making the 75-10-10-5. We're blending those casks. Yeah.
Gotcha. And yeah, it was really, I enjoy when a craft distillery, family owned, decides to do a lot of different mash bills, because I know it's a lot of work for you. I know it's each mash bill is slightly different in terms of the process. It takes a little longer or shorter. Fermentations are different. So it just takes time in general.
Oh yeah.
But it should be appreciated that not only are these things all available, they're good quality products. I did an initial tasting on them. I'm going to retaste them after the conversation, knowing a lot more about what's going on. And, I did enjoy them. And the other part is they're not um, for from a price point, they're very reasonable.
Yeah, we really think that it shouldn't be so hard to keep up with the Joneses.
I mean, I appreciate it. Well, keeping up with the Casey Joneses, yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah. See
sorry,
what
it
I
took
did
me a
there.
second. Yeah, that shouldn't have taken me a second, but it did. Fully admit that it did. So yeah, so now that we've talked about the mash bills, the distillation, and a little bit on the maturation. So just a couple other things on the maturation, which is as we've noted a couple times, you underwent this really
Mhm,
massive expansion relative to your size
mhm,
in 2022. And in addition to the additional still and the grandfather coming in, the other one was basically 10 times the production capacity, which was
mhm,
insane, and a 3,000 ish barrel rick house.
mhm,
And now you can produce 700 barrels per year.
mhm.
Um, so basically almost two a day. It's a huge uptick in all respects. So the first question I have, I guess, is before you had the rick house, you were using containers. They were shipping containers.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah. So did those barrels stay in the shipping containers or did they move to the rick house when the rick house was built?
So we've moved almost everything to the rick house at this point, but we do have some barrels in some of the shipping containers still. It's as you can imagine, a lot of labor to move them from shipping containers to the rick house, even though they're pretty close to each other. Yeah. Yeah.
Absolutely. And we've seen some good things come from shipping containers. There are a bunch of distilleries that
Oh, yeah.
have been on this podcast that use some exclusively shipping containers to mature their whiskeys. Uh, so with the 3,000 barrel rick house capacity right now, what would you say you're at? Like how many
We
barrels would you say
probably
you got?
have, I'd say we're probably at about 1,100 barrels right now.
Okay, so you still got a few years of
Yeah.
capacity to go, um, counting both inflow and outflow. Let's
Oh
say
yeah,
of barrels.
absolutely. And the rigs proper, the 3,000 barrels is the number that we have listed probably online, but the trusses in the building are actually angled up.
Mhm,
And so we can get 6 or 7 barrels on top of the rig. So the very, very top where the pitch of
mhm.
the trusses is high. So it's really going to end up being about 3,200 ish, something like that barrels. And you're absolutely right with the inflow and outflow. We've got a couple years here for sure.
So it won't have to be until maybe 27, 28 when you have to get another rick house
Yeah.
on the property. Uh, I did notice in the warehouse design, and this could be totally an aesthetic choice, but I was curious to ask. The warehouse design it's fairly short.
Mhm.
I mean, it's holding 3,000 barrels. It's not one of the 55,000 monstrosities that are out there.
Right,
Um,
right.
it
Mhm.
does have a what I would almost call like a dormer or a lip
Mhm.
at the top, where one slant goes over the other slant, and there are windows in that uh, on that flat side. So was that a more aesthetic choice, or was that to do something specific with the whiskeys?
Totally an
Or
aesthetic
and
choice.
by whiskeys I
Yeah.
mean
Totally.
all
Yeah.
spirits.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Totally aesthetics, and then the actual, because so that this is the first brick house on the property. It's right up front as you're pulling into the property. So we wanted it to be a showcase and really a beautiful structure is what we were going for that particular building. And I don't know that we would do the offset lip in the future. I don't know. Who knows? But as to the size of it, that's actually a function of Kentucky state law and building codes. So brick houses over a certain size have to be sprinklered, and others under a certain size don't. And so we're in that latter category because sprinkling a brick house is not cheap.
I imagine, yeah.
Yeah.
um Plus I would think it's also extra insurance. It's extra, a lot of extra
Oh,
cost
yeah.
just beyond the sprinklers itself. um yeah, I mean, I saw the design. I really did like it. So aesthetically, for me, good choice. I was thinking too, though, if you wanted, uh, because there are those windows on that lip, if,
Mhm.
if you open the windows at the top, if they can be opened, you'd have a different
Mhm.
airflow coming through the building than if
Oh,
you
absolutely.
did just
Yeah.
on the base level.
Yeah.
So, um, yeah. So, just a couple of other questions for you, and we're as we're coming towards the end, I wanted to pick up a couple of really fun things. One that has happened in the past, and then a couple that are coming in the future. So on one of them, on the this was back in 2021 on the Broken Cork, AJ mentioned that you had corn that went to space,
Yeah.
uh, and I think through Austin State University's astronomy club. I just love to hear the full story on that.
So and again, I'm not too in tune with what happened here, but I've heard anecdote that uh, basically what they did is they put corn into weather balloons and ran them up into the atmosphere, and then pulled some of those balloons back down, and actually did some distillations with the corn that went into space corn. So
Has that stuff is that going to be kept separate to really see what the effect was like, or is that folded into
yeah,
the
yeah,
rest?
absolutely,
Yeah,
absolutely. I mean, you never know. We'll see.
never know. Yeah, and also just looking to the future. Later this year, you're celebrating your 10th anniversary, um,
Correct. Yeah.
which should be in November, I believe, right?
Correct. Yeah. Yeah.
So yeah. Oh,
So
sorry. No, go ahead.
we'll be releasing our first 6-year-old white label single barrel for our anniversary, for our 10th year anniversary. And the we tasted three candidates for the first time last November when they turned 5. And the barrel that was picked, much to my chagrin, was not my favorite. But I'm suspecting the runner up when we taste this time is going to be the one that's picked. I'm rooting for it anyway. So what's fascinating? So you did I send you the white label samples, the 9631?
No, not that one.
Okay,
No.
so that spirit, those barrels in small batch are all just under 3 years old. So just all they're going to be 3 years this summer for sure. But we do have a handful of older barrels that we've kept back to do single barrel releases. The 10-year anniversary, we'll do the 6 year for that.
Hmm.
So the small batch, again, being a 9631, as you can imagine, it's a very sweet, it's corn forward bourbon. Of course it's going to be, you've got very little rye componentry here at all. Rye is what gives bourbon that pepper and coriander and spice and that body. And people, as your palate probably matures toward gravitate towards that rye spice. But you're new to the category, or you just like sweet, or you're bourbon curious. The white label is such a fascinating bourbon to get into that space because it's so completely unoffensive. Like it's great on your palate.
Hmm.
And we do those at 90 proof for the small batch. But as you can imagine, the 3-ish-year-old small batch versions of those they're not particularly complex because you don't have a very complex mash bill. They shouldn't be.
Hmm.
But man, the single barrels, as you've had time for that wood to interface with the distillate and that maturation process to happen, the wood is toning down that corn sweetness and replacing it with, and we had a 4-year-old single barrel that I'm thinking of when I'm telling you this, replacing it with this lovely, almost sassafras and vanilla cream soda flavors. And I'm really hopeful when we do the 6 year that we've got more of that going on. So yeah.
Nice. And I think I also heard there was a 5-year-old wheat that would be coming out too.
Yeah, we worked with folks on your side of the microphone and actually invited several of them in. And those that couldn't make it, we sent them samples from our barrel pick candidates to pick the first 5-year-old wheat. And that'll be out May 25th.
Nice.
So we're excited to see how that goes.
And last question I got to ask about the future too, which is I know John asked about American single malt, and I think the answer was that there's potential. Like as you said earlier, you've got the equipment that you can do that.
Right.
Whether or not you want to, that's different. So I'm going to ask a different spirit, which is, have you considered doing a rum?
Yes, purely for the ability to have rum casks on site, so we can finish.
That's a good reason.
Yeah,
that's a good reason.
Yeah, it's we're going to start doing some contract distillation. So we're with the facility on hand now and on site. We're actually producing for some other non-producing distilleries, and one of them in particular makes a shine with black strap molasses.
Mhm.
And so we're hoping to learn a little bit in the process of doing this distillation for him. And who knows, maybe we'll do a few rum casts because why not, you know?
Yeah, I think we just a couple weeks ago now, actually maybe a couple months at this point, spoke to Long Island Spirits, local to me, and they basically did that. They distilled their own rum, which in and of itself was really unique and great, very kind of grassy, more in the agricole style. And
Mhm.
but they were using it. I think it's up to 8 years now. They were using the casks to finish some of their bourbon, so they were having their own rum, finishing their own bourbon, which is a lot of fun. It's a great hallmark of you controlling the process, as you said earlier.
Mhm.
That vertical integration, you're controlling each part as you're going through. So yeah, I'm here for it. I hope to see it coming out.
All right.
So we'll see. So Cody, thank you so much for taking the time today. I should note you're a little under the weather, so I appreciate you barreling through this and pushing through to make this
Whatever
happen.
it takes, man.
So hang on with me for just a second after we finish recording. This has been another episode of the Whiskey Ring Podcast. Of course, as I said, this will be out after the eclipse. Hope you enjoyed it. Hope you were in a place where you could see it. If not, take care of yourself because it'll be 20 years till the next one. So make sure you're around for the next one. And all of the links that you'll need to follow Casey Jones Distillery, to buy their products, find out where they're available, and order for yourself will all be in the show notes for this episode when it goes live. So thank you again to Cody. This has been another episode, and I will see you all next week. Hey, folks, thanks for listening to another episode of the Whiskey Ring Podcast. If you like what you hear, please go ahead and click that subscribe, follow, or like button. Leave a rating and review on your podcast app of choice, and let me know what you want to hear. You can reach out to me through the podcast apps or email me at david@whiskeymyweddingring.com with any suggestions or ideas for new show guests. You can also support the podcast at patreon.com/whiskeymyweddingring. That's whiskey with an E, for as little as $1 a month. $5 a month gets you access to bonus content, including our soon-to-resume Under the Influencer series, and $25 a month means you join the Barrel Share Club. Each month, Barrel Share Club members get to try products sent to me for review, bottles from my own collection, and sometimes bottles that I just pick up because they're fun or interesting. Right now, only 5 spots remain in the Barrel Share Club, so grab your place today. Finally, please follow on Instagram. You can follow me at Whiskey My Wedding Ring or at Whiskey Ring Podcast. You can follow me on Twitter at Whiskey Ring. You can follow on Facebook at Whiskey My Wedding Ring or join the Facebook group, the Whiskey Ringers group. And I hope to see you there. Cheers, thank you for the support, and see you next time.